Tom and Tachyon, Croyd, Cranston, Jack, Braun, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Hello, welcome to Card Table. I sort of realized, even though I said I wanted to do a more raving about Fort Freak, I guess I did pretty much say a lot of what I wanted to say last week. One or two points that remained to be made. One was, as I mentioned in the videos for volumes 18, 19, and 20, which was like the first trilogy or triad of the Tor relaunch, how I particularly love the first of those three, Inside Straight. It's just such a strong return to form. They keep the good times rolling in 19 and 20. I don't think either of them is quite as impressive to me and exciting to me as 18 was. They both have a lot of good material in there, with all the material about the Radical and Mark Meadows, since that character is so dear to my heart. But one thing that's maybe worth kind of pointing out with that one is that the heart of the series, in a lot of ways, if you go back to the beginnings of the series, is that kind of like gritty New York. I mean, granted, at the time when the series first debuted, it was that 80s New York, which I think is probably a bit grittier and grislier than perhaps modern day New York, which is a different vibe. But there's still that kind of very urban. There's just a certain character to the city of New York that's very unique to that place, particularly the fictional location of Jokertown, this ghetto for those who have been mutated by the virus, the Jokers. That sort of creative interaction and that sort of imaginative interaction of the familiar and the fantastical, which is kind of all kind of the core of the appeal of Wildcards. Of all Wildcard stories, of course. And that works for any location to some degree, but I think the specific energy of Jokertown in New York City is just a key element of a lot of the best Wildcard stories. And it's an element that's completely missing because Volume 18 is, it starts out with that reality show that films in Los Angeles, American Hero, and then it becomes a kind of global concern when the committee is formed, the United Nations, the Committee of Extraordinary Interventions, who then, as I mentioned in those earlier videos, they go to all different places, both in the country, New Orleans, Texas, and also out of the country to intervene in the Middle East and in Africa, and et cetera, et cetera. Other than a few scenes in Volume 20 in Suicide Kings, there's very little material set in New York and or Jokertown. So when I remember when I first read Fort Freak, that was another element that made it so appealing to me. It was like, oh, I didn't really think about the idea that it was like something that was missing from the Tor relaunch up to that point until it was back. And then I realized, oh yeah, this is real Wildcards. We're not globetrotting and we're not in Hollywood. We're in the gritty depths of New York City and the streets of Jokertown. And that element of Fort Freak really feels like a true homecoming for Wildcards. Just that weird sort of unique New York City energy of like, one of the dirtiest cities in the world probably, but also just one of the coolest cities in the world. Yeah, something about coming back to New York and coming back to Jokertown feels so right, and it feels like, as I say, I didn't feel like it was missing as I read volumes 18, 19, and 20, but then coming to 21 and finding it there makes you say, oh, yeah, this is what Wildcards is. This is what it's really all about. I guess that probably belabors the point enough. The other thing I wanted to mention about Fort Freak that I think I only maybe touched on in part one was the fact that it does leave some loose ends that even now, I mean, you figure we're now up to like volume 30. Fort Freak was 21. So there's been quite a few volumes since Fort Freak, and there's still a couple loose ends that were left from that book, particularly involving the seemingly incorruptible police officer, appropriately named Angel, like Angel Grady or Angel O'Grady or something like that, where everyone was like, she's not on the take. She's not someone who would let herself be corrupted. She's a good cop. And then at the end you find out, oh no, she wasn't. She did get corrupted. But there's this lingering question of like, how was she convinced to sort of turn? Because she's just not that kind of cop. And there's this implication that there's a larger story there. I could be wrong. Maybe it's just a red herring, and maybe it isn't meant to be that. But I got that implication from reading it, that there was this sort of that the question was deliberately left open because there was a story to tell. And there's also some material with the character of Minal, the sex worker, when she is kidnapped by I believe the demon princes. Kind of a cliche trope in the setup where it's like take her to see the boss kind of a thing. But then it creates this mystery of like, they just call him the boss or her, and it's like who's the boss? It seems like another thing where they deliberately don't tell you who's the leader of the demon princes or who's at the top of that hierarchy, specifically so that you'll wonder and that maybe they'll come back to that in a later book. And they maybe will. Wildcards, as I've mentioned many times, they play the long game. So maybe these mysteries are still in a notebook somewhere. I don't know how the authors and how George R. R. Martin and Snodgrass track this stuff, if they've got a little like notebook with loose ends so that they can keep track of that stuff. I'd like to think someone's keeping track of it, but it's nice when things aren't left in the cracks. And really, over the years, Wildcards has been pretty impressive about even minor things from books going way back into the single digits. A reader is often surprised to see them come back, and yeah, we didn't forget about that. Here you go. Here's the story. Here's the payoff. Yeah, worth pointing out that because I did mention that I think this book is a great one for first-time readers, and I still, thinking about it, it might be the best. I guess Volume 1 would be the best one to start with, theoretically, but, it is old, and I know some modern readers have found that some stuff hasn't aged well. Some of the, sexual politics and just, some of the attitudes just feel a little, I guess, unwoke for the modern time. So if you're looking to maybe skip all that and read something that was published, after the turn of the millennium, Fort Freak, I think, is a really good starting point, and it helps that it's pretty standalone. It is kind of this self-contained murder mystery. Having said that, it's another reason why those loose ends that are there kind of niggle at me a little bit, where it's like, but it's not totally self-contained. There's still a few things that need some resolution. But still, overall, I still maintain that it's an incredibly satisfying read just on its own. It's a great starting point, a great one to, again, probably anyone watching this video is already a fan, but there's still talk that there's going to be a television adaptation, and at one point, maybe this is still the case, that they're actually using Fort Freak as the departure point for the television adaptation, that it's going to be set in a police station with these, Joker cops or mostly Joker cops, a couple ace cops or Jokers with ace powers, etc. That somebody looked at this whole mass of material and said, what would be the best entry point for people who want to explore this world through a television adaptation, and somebody said Fort Freak would be the best way. So I'm not alone in my thoughts, I guess, which is heartening. Okay, so one last thing. I can't remember how much I've harped on this already. I start to lose track of what I've said on these videos and what I've just thought in my own mind. But the fact that there are some a surprisingly large amount of connections that connect Fort Freak, which is Volume 21, back to Volume 8, which is, so 13 books apart in terms of like publishing dates, 20 years apart, something like that. But for whatever reason, like I said before, a lot of times the Wildcards authors will resolve things that go way back to earlier books or take threads from much earlier books and bring them back, surprisingly. And that can happen from any number of books, and it just so happens I don't know if it's coincidence or something more, although I don't know what that something more would be. But for whatever reason, a lot of threads, a lot of old threads that are picked up on in Fort Freak, if you trace those threads back to where they started, many of them trace back to Volume 8, like a sort of disproportionate amount. And I'll probably do a video just on that all on its own, of just the sort of the weird connections between it's like when people do those things about like the weird coincidences between the Kennedy assassination and the Abraham Lincoln assassination, all the weird little coincidences. There's a couple just like interesting little coincidental connections that where Volume 8 and Volume 21, One-Eyed Jacks and Fort Freak, have these qualities in common, and where they're the only two books in the entire series that feature character X or that explore thread Y or whatever. So I'll do a whole video about that. But I just thought I'd just toss it out there now that it's just another thing that struck me. I think it maybe struck me even on first read. Hey, that goes back to book 8. Hey, that goes back to book 8 too. Did the new authors, because there's 5 new authors in this particular volume, I wondered, like, did George R. R. Martin give them all? Was Volume 8 the only one he had to happen to have copies of that day, and just said, here, if you're not familiar with Wildcards, here, I got some copies of Book 8. Just read that one. I'm sure that's not what happened, but yeah, just a curious little coincidence, a numerological coincidence that probably means nothing, but struck me. Between this and the previous video, I think I've lavished a sufficient amount of praise on this book. It's a favorite. Mom, I know you're watching. My mom recently made fun of me because I say that every other book is one of my favorites, but I mean that makes sense, right? If it's a series that I really love, shouldn't I love most of the books in the series? Come on, Mom. Come on. But Fort Freak is another favorite. So, yeah, definitely worth buying. And yeah, anyone who maybe has happened upon this video who hasn't read a single Wild Cards book and is wondering where to start, Fort Freak would be a great one to start with, in my opinion. So, on that note, we'll close the books on Fort Freak, Volume 21. At the time of this recording, there are still 9 more books. Maybe by the time I actually post this one, it will be up to 10, because I know a 10th one is very much imminent. So plenty more material still to cover, which we will do in the weeks ahead. So see you next time.
Try and give our love back some sparks. He said, we'll get your love growing. But before we get going, may I highly recommend Cod Shocks? I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. Lately we've had some friction, 'cause my baby's hooked on shared world fiction.